Hello, welcome to History In Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms, and I'm here with my buddy and my personal professor, Bob Forrant.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing okay.
Well, we're going back to our roots, right? We're going
Yes.
back to the mid-19th century. We're going to go back to the mills, and as we know here in Lowell, there were lots of movements that were, going against the hours and the conditions, and so many things that came out of that, like our unions and things, but that wasn't for 100 years. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of a similar tale of really tragic things having to happen and awful sacrifices that were made by laborers at the time, but in Lawrence.
Right.
And some of those things didn't change anything until, 50 years ago from today?
Yeah.
But again, we're starting the
It's
mid-19th
crazy, right?
century.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and there's a connection. I mean, the story fits Lowell as well because the impetus really for what happens in Lawrence sort of festers in Lowell. So the really wealthy families from Boston who are building the mills in Lowell, there's a collection of people that start the Locks and Canal Company, and they build the Hamilton Mill and the Merrimack, the early mills in the city. And then some of them get a little bit greedy, and they think, okay, we need to build more. We've kind of exhausted the water power in Lowell, so we'll go upriver. We'll find another falls somewhere along the Merrimack, and we'll turn that farmland and pasture land and whatnot into another, glowing, shiny manufacturing city on the banks of the Merrimack. And so they do in Lawrence. And in Lawrence, they start something called the Essex Corporation, which is sort of the parallel, the twin, if you will, of the Locks and Canals Company. And John Lowell, who's one of the big investors in Lowell, and one of the people who's the treasurer of the Locks and Canals Company, then takes some of his money and invests it in Lawrence and building up the city of Lawrence. And that's how we sort of shift a little bit upriver to talk about what ultimately will become an infamous event, which is the collapse of a mill with several hundred workers inside of it.
they were so focused on lining their pockets, which we know, unfortunately, and we see it even today. Folks are lining their pockets and they don't really care about the health and safety of the workers. So set the scene for us, Bob. We're in the 1860s.
So it's 1845 when Lawrence starts being built, and the Essex Corporation is the responsible party for building the canals, creating the dam on the Merrimack to generate the water power, and as well build the mills. And so between 1845 and the early 1850s, it builds several mill complexes. This guy, Charles Storrow, is the head of the Essex Corporation. So he's the chief engineer. He's responsible for laying out the streets and figuring out the grand design. And he hires an engineer to be responsible for construction, this guy named Charles Bigelow, who's a West Point graduate, and he oversees the physical labor of building the city. And so they're going along fine into the early 1850s. There's an economic slowdown in the 1850s. There's not a lot of construction in the city, and John Lowell, the person I mentioned earlier who has invested heavily in the city, gets this idea that he wants, and so this is where everything begins to get murky, and you can see how wealth buys a privilege that then turns into a disaster. So John Lowell decides he wants a mill of his own. He doesn't want it as part of the Essex Corporation, or if he had been in Lowell, he doesn't want it as part of Locks and Canals. He doesn't want to be just a shareholder. He wants his own mill. And so he, through his brother-in-law, an attorney by last name by the name of Putnam, John Putnam, they negotiate with the Essex Corporation to let Lowell build the kind of mill he wants to build on the Merrimack. And the key thing here is they get a special deal. The Charles Storrow, representing the Essex Corporation, because there's been this economic slowdown, he wants activity in the city, obviously.
Right.
And Lowell says, I will invest in and build this building, but I want complete control over how it gets built. I want my guy, John Putnam, who's an attorney, doesn't know anything about building buildings, to oversee the construction. And in order for this to go up quickly, because he wants it up right away, I want to be able to choose all the subcontractors and purchase all the material I need to build the building from anywhere and from anybody. And I don't want to be bound by using your vendors. Now the problem is, from 1845 to 1852, the Essex Corporation has an established relationship with people making the bricks, people making the cement, people building the gears and the pulleys and everything needed to power the mill, building the actual columns that hold the mill building up. And they have proven specific contractors. And the agreement, interestingly, I found the agreement in the Lawrence History Center, handwritten agreement that basically says to Putnam, as the representative of John Lowell, yep, you can pretty much do whatever you want to do. And so they proceed to build the building that way.
That sounds like it's a breeding ground for disaster right there. You don't want to use the proven contractors, the people that you know
Yep.
already have established work in the city, and these places are standing. We know that they're structurally sound. So then you go into these other people, and this person who has no expertise, no background in this, but
Right.
Charles Bigelow did.
Yeah, Bigelow is a West Point graduate. And at the time, West Point is one of the leading places in the world, actually, that trains and educates construction engineers. And Bigelow has traveled around the country building things for the military, roads, forts, riverway improvements to keep away floods, breakwater things on the Atlantic to keep the water from coming up and flooding coastal communities. And so he has a really long track record of doing these really big projects, at which point then Storrow hires him to come to Lawrence and oversee the construction in Lawrence. So yeah, Bigelow is a certified, to the point that there is at that time. There's not a lot of certifications the way we think of them today, but he's educated, he's trained, he has a proven track record. And he's now sort of put in this really kind of, subservient in a way position to Putnam. Putnam in a way is a representative of Lowell, and Lowell is one of the biggest shareholders in the Essex Corporation, which is Bigelow's boss.
Oh,
So that's how this all sort of fits together.
tricky biscuits.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. Yeah, definitely. Good phrase.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Okay.
So what was the relationship? So you kind of described it already, but the relationship between Bigelow and Putnam. Putnam is it seems like he's kind of like a micromanager and with no experience, and Bigelow's having to answer to this guy.
Right.
But he has the experience. Do you think in all of your research, I don't know if it would have come across that maybe Bigelow was like, hey, we shouldn't do this, we should go to the guys that we know?
There's not a record like that I found, but again, sort of thinking about kind of logical behavior, my guess would be that Bigelow would raise red flags, and he probably would even go to Storrow, Charles Storrow, his ultimate boss within the Essex Corporation, and say, I'm getting the bad vibe here. But again, I think because of the economic slowdown in the country, the concern about there not being activity in Lawrence, because activity attracts investors, and now you have this guy who's very impatient, who wants this mill built for himself, that I think that what happened is power, in a way, sort of forced people to suspend what normally would be their good judgment. And under normal circumstances, they probably would have said, wait, slow down, dude, relax. And the thing is that the worst part of it is that as the building is being built, other workers, this is clear in the evidence that comes out after the collapse, other workers are saying to Putnam, to Bigelow, to Storrow, this isn't right. There's something wrong here. And they're just simply told, you basically do what you're told, build the building.
So we've got economic disaster, money, power, and lack of expertise.
Yep.
and the people on the ground not being listened to. Perfect recipe for disaster.
And you also have a city that's by this point, by the early 1850s, increasingly crowded with Irish immigrant workers looking for work. A lot of them are involved in the sort of rudimentary construction of the building. They need work, and again, so there are these pressures all the way around. And then the disaster comes because the key to the collapse ultimately is in the columns that hold the building up. So basically, from the ground floor all the way up, this is a 5-story building. There are these large columns that are holding the building up, and they start on the floor, and they go up to the ceiling, and then through the floor is a good-sized pin that goes from the top of one of these columns into the bottom of another one. And so these go up through the floors. And so the columns are really essential to holding up the building. And so ordinarily in Lawrence, all the columns were bought from the Lawrence Machine Shop, which was in downtown Lawrence, which was actually just 2 blocks away from the Pemberton. But Putnam and Lowell had found a foundry in Boston called the Eagle Foundry that underbid what it would cost to get the columns made in Lawrence. And so they go with the Eagle Foundry to build the columns. And this is where everything falls apart, literally and figuratively, I guess you could. It's not funny since so many people died. But the columns, so the Eagle Foundry ships the columns they've made, some of them. They ship them like batches at a time. They get to Lawrence, and they're unloading them from the truck from the wagon that they come on. They come by rail, and then they're taken from the Lawrence train station over to the work site. And as the workers are unloading the columns, and the wagon's maybe like 3 feet, 3.5, 4 feet off the ground, and it's dirt, column falls out of the wagon and breaks.
Oh my goodness.
And again, right away, somebody should have said, "Oh, this is going to hold the building up." It rolled off a wagon and it broke, it cracked, and people could see it. And everybody that was there knew it and saw it. But again, just go build the building. At that point, probably, Bigelow should have said, "I'm not working on this anymore."
Yeah.
Right? But again, who does that?
And in all times, how easy would that have been? And
well, he would have been fired.
Yeah.
And they probably would have just found somebody else. And so Bigelow, in a way, has some culpability, I feel, in the way that I write about this. But I don't feel like the blame is simply his.
Right.
But in the end, they build the building with these columns that everybody knows are no good. And then in 1853, Putnam and Lowell basically have made other really bad investments. They're losing money, and they have to sell the building.
Oh, no.
So they sell the building to 2 other investors who take the building over. And they run the building hard between 1854 and 1860 and the coming of the Civil War. And they want to run that building as hard as they can run it. They pack more machinery in the building. It's pretty clear, again, from looking at everything, that the building was built to hold. And so again, everything's building. There are cracks that start appearing in the corners of several floors of the building, the big noticeable cracks that every once in a while they actually get big, almost like steel bands, and they put them around these cracks to hold the building together, like gigantic
Band-Aids.
elastics to like force it together. And so all of this is building and building and building.
Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine. And so at the time, we have all kinds of people working in this building. We've got a good amount of men, but more women, and also children.
Yeah, very
working
young
in there. And so then all of these terrible things come together to
Right.
make
Yep.
this awful disaster.
Yeah, and so January 10, 1860, about 4:45 in the afternoon, so it's dark. It's wintertime, it's dark, it's cold. Second shift is running, the mill is running hard, running with several hundred workers inside. And eyewitness accounts talk about how at the far end of the building, so sort of looking at it, if you were in Lawrence and you're looking at it from the river edge, the building starts caving in. So I liken it when I teach with my students to, like, as a kid, you set up a row of dominoes and flick them over, and they kind of go slowly over like that. The building sort of slowly collapses on itself, sort of comes this way and then down. And it takes only about, again, by eyewitness accounts, it takes only about a minute for everything to come down. And some people hear it, and they can see from the far end, and they jump out windows, they run outdoors, and they get away. But of the roughly 600 or so people that are in there at the time, 100 people lose their lives, and another 300 people are injured, several of them really, really severely. And again, it's 1860, so there's not the kind of equipment that we would have today to try to figure out how to move beams and try to rescue people. A lot of people are trapped in the rubble. They haven't died in the immediate collapse. They can hear it and see it, and they crawl under machines, hoping that the machines will, like, be a bridge for them to keep away the rubble, and the rubble will pile up around them, but eventually they'll get out. And so that happens. A lot of people are sort of trapped that way, but they can't be saved because there's not a way to move all of that material. And eventually later that night, around 11 p.m., for reasons we're not clear on, a lot of the rubble catches on fire. And so it's horrible. A lot of the people who still are alive in the moment after the collapse now lose their lives in this fire because they can't be saved quickly enough to from the fire. And again, it's a mill building, so there's oil and all kind of other things, and fabric and material, and so it's very combustible once this fire starts. The coroner's inquest suggests that about 45 people were killed right away, and that another 60 or so people lost their lives in fires.
Oh my goodness, what a horrific tale.
Yep.
All I can think about is, like, this is the ramifications of greed and shoddy workmanship, and not at the fault of the workers.
Yep.
And then at that time, there's nothing in place to protect these people. The employers don't even feel a sense of responsibility. I think I read in some of your article, they have this idea that, well, you knew what you signed up for.
Yeah, there's in Massachusetts at this point has what are called limited liability laws. And if you're a worker, you basically, the risk was shared. And so the assumption was that if you were in a mill building, you understood all the risks that being in that mill building entailed. And if you were hurt, tough.
But you didn't have the same information as a worker that these people who were running the building they do.
Absolutely. But again, that was the way everything ran. So the reason that we know as much as we know about what happened is, by Massachusetts law, after a disaster like that, there had to be what was called a coroner's inquest. And so each county had a coroner. And so the coroner, in the interest of serving the mill owners, the inquest started 2 days later. The rubble's not even cool yet from the fires, and they're already having the inquest. And they want to do this because they want to figure out how they can assign blame and then move on, so no guilt transfers to any mill owners or the Essex Corporation or anybody else. And what happens is, as well, which spurs, like, let's do this right away, on January 11th, in Lowell, in Manchester, New Hampshire, in Fall River, where workers have heard about these collapses, they refuse to go to work.
I don't blame them.
And they say, until our buildings are inspected, we're not going to work.
Yeah.
And so this also, like, charges up the folks that want the inquest hearing to be, they want guilt assigned, and they want this done as quickly as they possibly can manipulate it. And so on January 12th, the inquest starts.
And what do they find?
There was such interest in the collapse. And something like that hadn't happened before. And everybody sort of like was in love with the idea of American industrialization and manufacturing, and now there's this blemish. And so newspapers from all over the country, all over the world came to Lawrence to cover the collapse. And then they stuck around for the inquest because it happened so quickly. And so all the newspapers have verbatim the testimony of the various people who testify.
Right.
And so by reading a whole bunch of newspapers, I sort of was able to, in a way, kind of put together what like a court record would actually be. It's clear that there are all these problems in the construction of the building. And the real key is people come forward. They, in the rubble of the building, they now have found the pieces of the columns. And when they're broken open because of the collapse, they can see that they're not made properly. So they're supposed to be perfectly round, and then the wall around is supposed to be the exact same thickness all the way around. That's what gives the column its integrity. I've learned a lot of engineering words. But a lot of them are like there's like barely a wall on one edge, and then it's super duper thick on the other side. And what, in the inquest, what people say is that this could have easily been found, that in the trade at the time, there's not the kind of things we have now to x-ray and do all that stuff, right? But the simplest test would be that you would take some of them from a batch and you would roll them on the ground, and if they were perfectly round, they would roll straight. If the wall was thick and thin, they would roll crooked. And you would immediately know, so you could, like on a wagon, if you were taking them out, you could roll some of them down a slight incline, and if they rolled crooked, they're no good. And it was just like a simple eyeball test that people could have used in the moment. The other thing that was testified to is on the day of the collapse, this is incredible, on the day of the collapse, they were moving big heavy machinery on the top floor of the mill, and they were using one of the columns as a fulcrum to pull the machinery around. They would put these like big heavy elastic bands around the machine, and then they would pull it around the pole. And so by pulling it around the pole, the suspicion is that they actually broke one of the pins that went through the floor to hold the building up, and that essentially was like the final trigger, if you will, that basically. And the eyewitnesses essentially say it started collapsing from that corner where that had taken place. Like years later, the collapse of the mill becomes a convention topic for engineering conventions. Why did it fall? And they start creating blueprints for how to design buildings better, for how to regulate this. But these guys get off the hook. Putnam, John Lowell, Charles Storrow, they all get off the hook, and they essentially blame Bigelow. Bigelow's the fall guy. The inquest blames Bigelow and says Bigelow's responsible for the 41 or 42 deaths in the collapse. We can't blame him for the people who died in the fire. So he's only responsible for these. And so Bigelow leaves Lawrence, ends up living for a while in, I think, Fall River, and then dies a really young man. He's in his 40s when he passes away, and I'm sure the stress and whatever of having that catastrophe hang around his neck is just something to be really, obviously I think would be really hard to live with. And so he's left holding the bag. What's interesting is I was able to get some letters and things from the Lowell family and the Putnam family from Putnam's sister. And right after the building collapses, I forget her first name, but she writes a letter to Putnam and says, yeah, dude, this is your fault. I know you messed this up. But that never makes it into the inquest.
Of course not. Of course not.
Nor do the people who built the columns ever get called to testify. From the Eagle Foundry, even though it's pretty clear from everybody's testimony that the faulty pillars are really the trigger of of the collapse. They have since closed the foundry and moved to someplace in Ohio, and they're never even telegrammed to come back to testify.
That is, there's no accountability. The people in power get to remove themselves from actually their actual involvement in all of this. Yep. And the one guy who actually knew what he was doing, who probably said something about it, he's the one who gets to carry all of that weight for
Yep.
the rest of his life.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
loses his job, and people probably looked at him funny for a while, and all kinds of issues
It'd
of
be
integrity.
probably hard to believe he'd ever engineer a building again.
Exactly. What a tragedy all around.
Yeah, I mean, and people as young, some of the Irish young women workers are as young as 10, 11, 12. Over 1,000 families in the city are impacted.
Wow.
As a consequence of people losing some people can never work again. Some people are out of work for months because they have broken arms, broken legs, things like that. The city collects money for a while to defray medical costs. They set up a makeshift hospital for a while to care for people who are hurt, to dispense some level of aid. There's money collected to give to the families of people who have someone in the family who's lost their life, who might be like the primary wage earner in the family, to try to subsidize them for a little while. But eventually, in the tenor of the times, the mayor of Lawrence says we don't want any more money being donated to the city because all these folks are going to get used to not working, and we can't have that. Daniel Saunders is the mayor's name, and he basically he first puts out a call for money, and then he puts out a call a few weeks later, stop sending money. These people will never go back to work if we keep subsidizing them. So stop sending us money.
There's so many things we could continue to talk about just with that alone.
You know, in America, we don't have federal health and safety regulations and laws that might make something like this not happen until OSHA in the 1970s.
Of course.
So we're talking about 1860, 1972.
Wow. 100 years later, just like when we got the workers' hours and rights.
Yep.
100 years later. Wow. America.
Yeah, well, that's why being a history teacher is fun. Fun and dread at the same time.
Yes.
I mean, there's always some story like this that can sort of show the country in an interesting light.
It's such a stark, somber light.
Right.
Well, thanks again, Bob, for teaching us all, and hopefully we go back and reflect on the different types of choices we can make to make our world better. See something, say something.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that.
Yep.
And thank
Agreed.
you all for tuning in. This has been History in Lowell.